Think about your favorite series. Chances are the last book you read has a higher rating than the first one. Odd, is it not? After all, the first book had to succeed for the sequels to even exist. The explanation lies in a principle I call continuation bias. Over the course of the last years, and having dedicated many videos to a range of science fiction series, I have more than once mentioned a phenomenon that struck me as remarkable. It is the observation that the ratings of books published later in a series tend to be higher than those of the preceding novels. At first glance, this seems somewhat odd, since the very first novel usually needs to achieve a certain degree of success and widespread appeal in order to justify the creation of a saga of sequels. Their first book is therefore the prerequisite for all subsequent volumes. Now, as some of the more avid viewers of these reviews may already anticipate, there is a principle that can explain this observation through a very basic mechanism. This principle, as mentioned previously, is the so-called continuation bias. Continuation bias describes the tendency for later entries in a series to receive higher ratings, not necessarily because the books are better, but because of the way readership filters itself over time. Readers who enjoy the earlier novels are more likely to continue with the series to the end, thereby skewing the ratings upward. In contrast, those who did not enjoy the first installments tend to abandon the series early, and their opinions no longer influence the scores of the later books. A strong indicator of this filtering effect is the number of ratings. This figure tends to decrease as a series progresses. This decline is an expected outcome. After all, would one truly expect that God Emperor of Dune has been read and rated by more people than the original Dune? Continuation bias is not a universal rule. It requires several assumptions and has clear limitations. First, we must assume that the novels within a series are of somewhat similar quality and standard. Quantifying the quality of science fiction and fantasy novels is a notoriously difficult task and highly subjective. The problem becomes even more circular when we consider that aggregate user ratings, the very metric often used to quantify quality, are the ones being skewed here. From the outset, therefore, this self-referential issue must be acknowledged. The second assumption is more straightforward. People will give up on a book series if they are not satisfied. Reading is time-consuming compared with other forms of entertainment. Viewers may still watch the next season of, let's say, Rings of Power in the hope of improvement, or simply for entertainment at the creator's expense. Similarly, they might give the next Star Wars film a chance, buoyed by positive feedback surrounding the last season of Andor. Nevertheless, audiences do abandon franchises once enough damage has been done to the intellectual property. However, there is an important difference. Even when audiences give up on a television series or a film franchise, the sheer number of people who still watched, hated, and most importantly rated these productions is large enough to register a clear downturn in reviewer scores. Book series, by contrast, tend to lose readers much more definitively and quietly, which makes continuation bias more pronounced. The third assumption concerns the order in which a series is considered. For some series, this is straightforward, as the publication order matches the chronological order of events. Yet, this is not always the case. For the examples I have examined in this video, I chose to use the publication order, as it is the order most likely to be followed by first-time readers, especially those who became fans of the first novel before later volumes were even released. Finally, a sufficient number of entries is required for any meaningful analysis. 3 books, for example, provide too little data in my opinion. In some cases, I therefore combined multiple series that belong to the same narrative universe, arranging all these novels according to their publication order. Let us now examine examples of book series in which the assumptions mentioned earlier are more or less satisfied and where we can clearly observe continuation bias in action. The first example is J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series with its 7 books. I must admit that I am not a Potterhead, but through cultural osmosis I am well aware that the series is regarded as having very few, if any, notable weaknesses. The ratings reflect this perception, every entry receives strong scores on Goodreads, and in general one can observe a gradual uptick in the average ratings with each new installment in the franchise. The second example is the wider Commonwealth universe created by Peter F. Hamilton, which has been featured extensively on this channel. I included all novels set in this universe, the original duology Pandora's Star and Judas Unchained, the Void trilogy, the Chronicles of the Fallers, and also the widely disliked Misspent Youth. The latter, with its rather low 3.39 average rating, marks the beginning of the series and is something of an anomaly. But even if we set it aside, we still see a steady increase in the average ratings across Hamilton's publications. In fact, even within the individual subseries that I mentioned earlier, that after all constitute the Commonwealth universe, the upward trend in ratings is visible with each additional novel. Next, let us turn to one of the more recent and highly successful science fiction series, James S.A. Corey's The Expanse. This saga comprises 9 full-length novels. I have chosen to ignore the short stories and their anthology for this particular discussion. Nonetheless, the same trend emerges, despite some deviations. The overall trajectory confirms the presence of continuation bias. As a side note, I will surely dedicate separate review videos to this series in the future. It is only a matter of time, I promise. Moving on to fantasy once more, we have Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, which provides another instructive case with its 14 volumes. Here, continuation bias technically holds, but we can clearly see a dip in the middle of the series, likely due to either an actual decline in quality or at least a perceived decline among the readers. Similarly, Alistair Reynolds' Revelation Space Universe, including the Prefect Dreyfus novels, Diamond Dogs, Turquoise Days, and the short story collection Galactic North, also demonstrates continuation bias. Interestingly, the pattern resembles a sawtooth. Every odd-numbered novel scores lower, while each even-numbered one scores higher. In this case, as noted before, it is crucial to use publication order rather than narrative chronology, given the somewhat convoluted release history in relation to the order of events within this series. Following Revelation Space, we can examine Ian M. Banks' culture novels. Here the pattern becomes even more chaotic. From the 4th book onwards, it almost seems as though every second novel is regarded as either excellent or subpar by readers. Nonetheless, if we divide the books into these 2 categories, we can still observe an upward trajectory within each group. Alternatively, by averaging everything together, the broader influence of continuation bias still becomes apparent. My interpretation of the more extreme fluctuations, particularly in the Revelation Space and Culture series, is that authors such as Reynolds and Banks frequently experimented with tonal shifts, unconventional storytelling approaches, and narratives that sometimes stood apart from the larger universes in which they were set. Thus moving from redemption arc to absolution gap, or more strikingly from consider Flebas to the player of games, or even inversions, can significantly alter how readers perceive the quality of a novel. In contrast, authors like Peter F. Hamilton or James S. A. Corey often maintained a more consistent tonal and stylistic framework across their series, even though both occasionally introduced shifts in emphasis or narrative style. We would not be good scientists or number crunchers if we did not also examine counterexamples, cases where continuation bias fails to explain the observed data. The first example is George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series, not Game of Thrones, the television series, which would be an entirely separate discussion. Here we see a slight downward trend in ratings. As a counterpoint to this counterexample, one must also note that the series is not finished, if it ever will be. To the dismay of the fandom, there are only 5 novels to date. I have not considered the other works set in Westeros that predate A Song of Ice and Fire in its chronology, but they would not improve the trend, so no harm done in leaving them out for this particular analysis. A more extreme case is Orson Scott Card's Enderverse, particularly the Ender Quintet and the Shadow Quintet. I did not include every related novel, as the extended universe quickly becomes unmanageable. The trend here is quite clear. Ratings decline with time, almost an inversion of continuation bias. Only Ender's Shadow breaks the pattern with its strong 4.31 rating despite being the 5th book published. While drafting this script, I also realized that I had excluded the most recent entry, The Last Shadow, which merges the 2 quintets. At 11th place in publication order, its 3.62 average rating on Goodreads sits below the scale of this plot, and therefore does not alter the overall trend. Frankly, I could not be bothered to update the graph for such a lousy book. In this case, one of our key assumptions, that the novels within a series maintain a roughly comparable standard, does not hold. Subjectively, the books simply get worse. The tonal and structural shift between Ender's Game and the later Ender Quintet is dramatic, while the Shadow Quintet arguably suffers from the opposite issue: too much similarity and too little innovation. But enough of the Enderverse. Finally, let us consider one of science fiction's most foundational works, Frank Herbert's Dune, and the 5 sequels written by him. This series is relatively simple to analyze. The original Dune simply stands head and shoulders above the others, with only Children of Dune showing a modest uptick in ratings. Many fans found Dune Messiah as the direct sequel disappointing, particularly because of its unexpected approach to Paul Atreides' character arc. Such tonal and thematic shifts likely explain the steep drop in ratings directly after the original novel. There is still a vocal minority that continues to praise God Emperor of Dune, but this enthusiasm is definitely not widespread. At least you cannot see it in the data and in the ratings. Personally, I share reservations about this particular book. Feel free to comment if you would like me to dedicate a future video to explaining why I do not share the God Emperor enthusiasm. In conclusion, continuation bias is by no means universal, nor is it an iron law, but it does manifest often enough to be noticeable. Anticipation for the ending of a long series may also play a role in elevating ratings. By the final volumes, readers are deeply invested in a vast narrative universe and in complex characters, whose arcs require resolution. If the conclusion is executed well, a crucial assumption, ratings tend to rise. The opposite should also be true. Failing to deliver in the final books will inevitably be punished. However, I found few convincing examples of this latter case, where ratings rise steadily only to collapse due to a botched ending. More often, the decisive shifts occur early, particularly when the narrative tone changes abruptly. Keep in mind, this is only related to book series. I did experience this more than once for TV series or movies. I hope you enjoyed this exercise in number crunching and literary analysis and perhaps learned something new along the way. While continuation bias may not always be quantifiable with precision, it nonetheless offers a compelling explanation for why, in some series, the final volumes, though not necessarily superior in quality, still receive noticeably higher ratings. In those cases, continuation bias may well be the key to understanding the pattern. If you liked this video, you may also enjoy the other reviews and content on my channel. Feel free to leave a comment if you want to discuss the novels or if you want to suggest other books that I should review in the future. Please consider upvoting and subscribing, it is much appreciated. Thank you for watching and until next time.